Hello and welcome everybody. Our webinar will be beginning shortly. I'll give a minute for everybody to start getting into the room. Again, thank you for joining us. Our webinar will be beginning shortly. I just want to take a second to let you know a couple of our upcoming webinars. On October 12th, Tuesday, we have quantifying occupational heat stress among U.S. agricultural workers in partnership with Emma Moyahayan at Johns Hopkins Education and Research Center. And on November 3rd, we have health effects of cell phone and cell tower radiation implications for 5G in partnership with Joel Moskowitz and the Center for Family and Community Health. On behalf of the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health, I would like to welcome you to our webinar. A few housekeeping items first. You will be muted during this presentation. If you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the online Q&A box instead of the chat. It keeps it a little easier for us to keep track of your questions so we can get to them at the end. We will save time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health's YouTube page and on our website. All participants who logged in with their registration email for the full live presentation today will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording and an evaluation form that will qualify participants for a certificate of completion worth 1 continuing education contact hour. Once the evaluation is completed, you will be able to access and print your certificate. Also, you will get a copy of that recording in that email tomorrow and any relevant resources. So at this time, I would like to welcome our presenters. We have Anthony Eleftherion, who is a writer specializing in health literacy communications. He has over 15 years of experience developing easy to use and easy to understand health materials for patients from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds with varied literacy needs. He holds a Master of Fine Arts degree from the Iowa Writers Workshop at the University of Iowa, where he was awarded a Maytag Fellowship, and he has been an Olive B. O'Connor Fellow at Colgate University. As Director of Communications at Health Research for Action, or HRA, he leads a team of writers, designers, and communication researchers who use participatory design to develop health resources for vulnerable and underserved populations. Our second presenter today is Becca Fried, and Becca is the Associate Director of Health Literacy Communications at the Health Research for Action, or HRA. She has about 30 years of experience as a writer and editor, and for the last 7 years, her work has been focused on health information through a health literacy lens. Becca aims to develop information products that empower people to get their health needs met. Thank you both for joining us, and I will pass it over to Anthony now.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As Jessica was nice enough to introduce us, I'm Anthony Eleftherion. I am Director of Communications at Health Research for Action. And as she was saying, I lead the team here in how we develop, the team here that develops communications of all sorts, websites, booklets, infographics, videos, etc. And we'll just switch it off here. For those of you who don't know, the Health Research for Action, or HRA, is a center at the School of Public Health that seeks to address disparities through research and intervention. The center's been around for over 20 years and was the brainchild of Glenn Syme, who some of you may know was among the first to conduct research into the social determinants of health. We are a center that, from its inception, incorporated participatory design methods to develop and test communication materials, and that has emphasized being health literacy practitioners. And that's a distinction that I'll get into a little bit more as we move along. Some of the objectives today that we'd like to take part in with you all is to describe the health literacy approach to communications, explain how to use those participatory design methods to improve communications, also identify communication strategies for health numeracy, and delve into some strategies for improving health literacy, and describe how health literacy principles can improve communications about occupational health and safety. So today we are going to discuss how to use health literacy techniques to improve the communications that we as professionals develop, especially risk communications. essentially what we want us to construct or present the health information people need in a way that they can understand, preferably the first time they read it or hear it, such that they can make informed decisions about their health, safety, and environment. So, but let's discuss what health literacy is. It has three components. The first happens to be the most commonly understood component, and it relates to individuals and their ability to understand, evaluate, and use health information. It's important to understand that an individual's health literacy is affected by many factors, as some of you may know, such as education, cognitive abilities, experience with health conditions, healthcare, medications, etc. But it's also affected by their interactions with healthcare personnel, which takes us to the next component of the definition. And that is healthy. It's just about the person receiving information. It's also about the person sending it. So a healthcare professional or communicator can be health literate by presenting information in ways that is easy to understand and act on. Next thing here. And the same is true of organizations, whether their work takes place in hospitals, lab facilities, or open fields. Their ability to provide health or risk information is measurable, and through practice and policy, quite possible to improve. So when we think about these last two components, we might see health literacy in another way, namely as a collection of tools with which we communicate health information, whether it's presented as an infographic, a checklist of safety tasks, a greeting, or an interview. These tools that we'll discuss today can help us reduce the barriers inherent to most health and risk information. I also want to point out that this definition that you're receiving today for health literacy is something relatively new. It's changed a bit over the years. So this particularly about health literate organizations is something that's come up with Healthy People 2030, where the definition has been expanded. The understanding around health literacy has always been about an individual's ability, but as we learn more and more about the structures that contribute to people's understanding and ability to act on information, we see that it's a much broader topic, right, with more components. So now that we have a basic contemporary definition of health literacy, we also like to show you what having health literacy is like. So all too often we think of things for what they are and not enough about what it is like to experience them, especially when it comes to someone's health. So this video should give us a better understanding of what it's like to experience limited health literacy. I'm just going to switch my screen here for a moment. Forgive me.
Anthony, if you can do me a favor and just reshare and do share computer audio, that way everybody can hear it. You have to stop screen sharing and then restart.
Okay.
And there's a little checkbox at the bottom.
Sure. Oh, doesn't seem that I have that capability.
Repair that. Great. I didn't ask 31. I went into the gynecologist and complained about part of this not working correctly. And he said, we can repair that. Great. I didn't ask all the right questions. When I showed up 2 weeks later at the admissions office at the hospital, they put enough papers in front of me. I'll bet there were 5 papers that I needed to sign. Well, I wasn't going to say, excuse me, but I don't read really well, and I certainly don't read fast, and I'm concerned with some of these words. To me, it was lines and circles over sheets and sheets and sheets. And I wasn't going to reveal my sense of stupidity, so I signed everywhere they told me to sign. Never read it. And then a couple weeks later, in the follow-up office visit, the nurse said, "How are you feeling since your hysterectomy?" Now, I acted as normal as I could. Inside, my mouth fell open, and I thought to myself, how could I be so stupid as to allow somebody to take part of my body, and I didn't know it?
Right, so as you can see there with that really terrible story, health literacy affects many components and can have significant impacts on people's lives. Switch over, pardon me. Sorry for that delay. Moving on to the next thing here. So you can see, from that story of someone getting consent without knowing what she's consenting to. I want to point out that these experiences are very common, and not just for people who don't read well. It seems to indicate that story that this person is completely at fault, which is really not, because no one checked in with her, right? But more importantly, as we can see here from our slides, nearly 9 out of 10 people struggle in some way with health information. This includes people with college education, people who work in healthcare, people on this call. This includes me. And it affects all of us, of course. And especially when we're in a stressful situation, such as trying to figure out how to remain safe at work or keep ourselves and our loved ones safe from the harm of wildfire smoke. It's also important to note that many of us understand only the most basic health information. And research shows that health literacy tracks with health status more closely than age, income, employment, education, or racial or ethnic group. So to dig a little deeper on the US population, we know that the average American adult reads between the 7th and 9th grade level, and that most health info is written at the 10th grade. Personally, I find that number much too low. We have lots of partners here at HRA with whom we work, and many of them ask us to revise materials that they've created. And I can tell you that when we run things like grade level tests, they often come in at the college level or higher. And these are people that have been creating communications of all sorts for years and years and years. And there's a pretty good reason for that, we think. And part of it is, especially people who wind up in a field where they're communicating in some capacity, but especially I would say the written word, everyone has always kind of been congratulated and applauded and rewarded for sounding smart. And with health literacy, we learned that it's the opposite, right? We need to reduce the polysyllabic words and the long sentences with multiple clauses. They are not rewarding for the reader, at least not in this context. So in some sense, practicing health literacy is about unlearning all of those gold stars and pats on the back we've all received throughout our academic and careers. So, but I want to point out this last bullet here, and it states that most adults read 3 grade levels lower than the highest grade of school that they completed, and perhaps confirming that that old adage that few of us are as smart as we think we are. So with that said, we want to take you through a bit of an exercise here. I mean, we know what it's like for someone else to struggle with health information. We want to spend a few minutes looking at this passage. And the goal essentially is to try to figure out what it's about. So we want everyone to take a minute or so, read through this. Obviously, you can see we've omitted words, and then try to get a sense of what this piece is about. All right, I think we're gonna switch over to see what those missing words are. And they're all bolded here. This is something that should be at least somewhat familiar to some on this call. Here we have basically a highly technical paragraph for non-experts anyway, and where we've just omitted mostly the simple words, right? Or I should say words that are a little bit above basic. And the experience of most people who would look at the previous iteration with all those words missing, they would struggle to glean what that paragraph means. And for us, this indicates what it's like for many people to try to understand health and risk communications. As health communicators and people who are in this world, or we're writing about a specific topic that we know a lot about, it's easy to not realize that we use jargon quite often, and are using terms that aren't difficult, that aren't easy for laymen to understand, and the same is true with risk communications of any kind. So how do we implement health literacy into our organizations and personal workflows? How does one do health literacy? Obviously, we've talked about it as a theoretical construct, and its impact on patients, but there's this whole other component to it, that is employing the best practices of this area to improve communications. And the first step is to aim to create a universally acceptable communication. This means treating everyone as if they have limited health literacy skills. And some may hear that and think, but won't that be insulting to the members of our audience who are highly educated? This is a common myth with health literacy. And we might respond, would that same person be insulted if we were, if we were to make it easier to understand the directions that come with furniture from IKEA? Chances are no, they would not find that insulting, right? And that's because everyone benefits from communications that are easy to understand, regardless of their education level. This is partly because we all have difficulty understanding in some situations. This does not mean, however, that we all have the same needs or process information in the same way. So writing and designing for maximum understanding or accessibility by the widest possible audience reduces discrimination. So there should not be different levels of difficulty for different types of people. So the health literacy approach usually begins with empathy. And that's the ability to understand the thoughts, experiences, feelings, and needs of others. Right? Empathy makes us ask questions that lead to helpful answers, such as, with whom are we communicating? What are their main concerns? What is their daily life like? And what questions will they have? Right? A big part of our job as communicators is to imagine the barriers to understanding experienced by our audience and work to remove them. And empathy helps us get there. So one way to gather the information that you need is through participatory design, of which there are 3 types, but today we're only going to focus on user-centered design. Sorry, my slides are moving a little faster. So user-centered design is when something is created by designers or writers for users, as opposed to users for users, for instance. However, to do so well, we must engage those users through things such as community advisory committees, focus groups, key informant interviews, design thinking workshops, and usability testing. So each of these can be a valuable component of any communications project. It really just depends on the kind of project that you're doing and the kind of resources you have and the amount of time you have, etc. So at HRA, we do all of these. It just really depends on the project. But the method that we use most frequently across all of our projects is usability testing, which is where we take whatever we are developing, let's say a leaflet, and give it to members of our audience, usually 6 of them for each revision, or each version that we create, and interview them individually to learn whether they can understand, navigate, use it, like it, or trust it. So it's fairly easy and relatively inexpensive to incorporate into the development process, but it does take some training to learn how it is different than, say, something like market research, right? And we're not going to get too much into usability testing at all. That's pretty much it. But it is a super important topic. And if anyone was interested in learning more about it, we could do a whole session just on that and training people how to conduct usability testing. So just wanted to give everyone a sense of what a development process could look like. I'm sure for many people here, this will look somewhat familiar. If anyone who creates some kind of communications material, this might be familiar. Essentially, there are 4 phases. There's the research. So, and just so everyone knows, this is probably more of kind of an ideal situation where you have lots of resources and plenty of time and all of that. Research, you're looking to meet your audience and determine who it is that you're trying to talk to, right? So maybe you do clean form interviews, maybe you run focus groups. Obviously, that takes a not insignificant amount of time, especially to kind of consolidate all the information you gather at the research stage and make sense of it in order to develop something, right? So here, you may even decide not just who it is that you're trying to talk to, but what it is that they need, right? That's the big thing that everyone tries to get from research, and things like key informant interviews and focus groups. Maybe it doesn't come out directly, but all the information together, and thought out and considered and brainstormed by a design team would come up with what kind of resource is needed, what kind of material is needed, what would get people to perform the task you're looking to have them perform, whether that's perform safety functions at work or to take charge of your own health, say a condition early. So and then at that stage, you're moving into development, where you start creating initial drafts. So obviously, everyone's probably familiar with this. Outline, and then outline, then the content development, usually design concepts of the look and feel of something, and then the overall executed design. At this point, and that could take a long time to do depending on the research you're creating, you move into testing. And here you're really looking for audience feedback, right? So this is where we do usability testing. Typically, our group does. We tend to recruit 6 to 9 audience members and interview them individually and compile potential edits and revisions and ideas, or even just new materials based on those findings. 6 to 9 is kind of the sweet spot. You could do 5 in terms of learning most of what you learn. I think you learn basically somewhere between 85 and 90% of what you're going to learn from qualitative testing in that 6 to 9 range. If anything after 9, you're not going to learn anything new, or at least not much. And to get significant results past that, you have to go up to 50. So it becomes basically quantitative testing. And then at that point, you may revise and make those changes or develop a new material, whatever it is, you incorporate the changes from testing. And then if you have resources, you might test that final or near final product again with a different group of users. So again, this is kind of an ideal process, but it's something that everyone could take a piece of and figure out how it works into their own particular work situation. All right. So we do want to, before we get into more details about how to actually, some of the best practice of health literacy, we want to take a look at some graphics, some materials to give you a sense of how health literacy can improve things, what health literacy looks like, what good looks like. And here, you can see that there's a lot. This is a piece from UC Davis about wearing a respirator. So there's a lot that works in this infographic. Sorry, I need to move these pieces so I can see. There's a lot that works here, very simple. graphic. So on the whole, it's pretty good. But there's also room for improvement, as with any material. We have the viewpoint that we can always make communications better over time, especially our own. And that's what the iterative design testing process that we just discussed is really for. So I wanted to just go over some of the strengths and weaknesses here. Firstly, we know immediately what this infographic is about. It's about wearing a respirator, right? It's very, very straightforward. You can see some of the information is very direct and clear. It's all active voice, right? So this pointer says this is the top of your head. This goes below your ears. You have to press on this nose piece, adjust these straps. Very, very simple language. There's plenty of white space. You can see the text itself. So the font is mostly large enough. And there's enough contrast between the background and the captions, right? You can make some argument that some of those smaller images are, potentially a little vague, the male images, I mean, but for the whole, on the whole, and maybe you might add captions to that to make it even clearer for users. But on the whole, this is a pretty successful document. Sorry. All right, and we want to show another here. It's also from UC Davis. This is something that employees would use for smoke exposure for employers, right? So it's a list of tasks, but you'd be surprised how easy this is to make extremely complicated and discouraging for most users. And here, again, very, very clear what this is about. There's an introduction here that states, that gives some instructions. And then there is an actual checklist, which fosters some interactivity, and which brings people in. Looking at the text itself, the information is grouped well, and we'll get into some of that in a minute. You can see that there's contrast in the sections, so people can distinguish one bullet to the next or one group of bullets to the next, from the gray to the white to gray to the white. There are lots of things this does well. Again, there's a lot of content on this page, but this is to some degree what good could look like for a print problem. All right. So when we talked about why writing and revising for health literacy is important, we want to dig into some of the best practices now. And to be honest, you'll find many of these strategies to be pretty common sense. They aren't difficult to grasp or intimidating. They just take some time to integrate and to learn how to do right away. Don't have to think about it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So today we're only going to discuss a few of these basic ideas about presenting information. You may have noticed that at no point have we mentioned plain language. And that's because it's usually the thing that most people think about when they think about health literacy. And it leads lots of practitioners to rely on things like reading grade level scales to determine whether something is health literate. But generally, health literacy is about much more than plain language. What we are doing is designing information, basically. And that means thinking about more than the number of syllables in a word, and certainly the length of a sentence. So those things are very important too, of course. So in fact, how we group information, as we just saw, can greatly affect how easy or difficult it is for someone to read and understand. So in health literacy, we do this through something called chunking, which is really just a practice of linking information together in small chunks, and by using as well advanced organizers, which is to signal to the reader what is up ahead. So as a rule, chunking appropriately means focusing on one main idea per paragraph, just as it says in the elements of style, which in turn helps a reader, it helps a reader keep focused on the message. We also try to keep each section or paragraph to 3 to 5 sentences. And this aligns with what most humans can hold in their short-term memory. generally 2 to 5 items, and sometimes less, depending on whether someone is stressed or doesn't understand a few words in what they're trying to understand. It also helps us make sure we only impart the important information about the message. So chunking helps in these ways. It gives the reader less to remember. It creates more white space, encourages the reader to say yes to your text, and gives the reader more confidence to learn. So to expand on those ideas some, imagine you're handing someone who struggles with health information a form, and this form is 2 columns, both of which are packed with information and few breaks. So in many cases, that person won't even try to read that form and may believe that they can't. So we've seen this is the very first barrier to understanding. Someone looking at things we create and saying, I will never understand that, right? And our job is to remove that barrier and signal to readers that they can understand. So here I want to show you a couple of examples of chunking, right? Pretty straightforward. As you can see, the sections and paragraphs all discuss just one topic. This is from a guide that the HRA puts out in California and Arizona. This is the latest version. It's still in development. That's why there's a watermark on the photo. But you can see all the paragraphs are short, and as are the sentences. Pretty straightforward, right? We're trying to group information in bite-sized chunks of people so it's palatable for people. And so they don't immediately feel that they can engage with it. So keeping with the theme of one main idea per paragraph, a good way to signal to the reader what that idea is an advanced organizer. So an advanced organizer is simply an information or a statement that introduces the topic. It's used in adult learning, youth education, and it essentially allows learners or readers to anticipate what the upcoming information is about. It helps readers get a brief and near immediate understanding of what's coming. So it's important to know too that it can apply to a first sentence, a paragraph, or an entire page, right? And here we see an example of that. This is also from our parent guide. So here we have a top level header, and that's feeding your baby, and it indicates what the entire page is about. So people can kind of carefully come into the information. They're not immediately struggling to understand where they are, what they need to do. They understand this is what this page is about. It's scannable. And all the subheads indicate what each section is about. And then in some cases, the first sentences also indicate what the reader is about to read. So here in that, how to know if your baby is eating enough, the first sentence is to know if your baby is eating enough. That's an advanced organizer. We're setting up the information so people can embrace it. This is also a pretty good example too. I want to point out that with health literacy, any improvement is worthwhile. So nothing is perfect, least of all when you have limited real estate here to work with, as you can see in this other paragraph, basics of bottle feeding. There's a lot of information there. And it looks like it's more than it is. But we've and sometimes it's unavoidable when you're developing materials. You have to do what you can, right? So there's a lot of information to be conveyed. We broke it into a small, as many small pieces as we could. We put them in lists, so there's plenty of white space. But again, you have to take whichever wins you can. And in this case, we had a lot of information to impart, so we put a lot of information there. But there are limits to all of that. But I do want to point out that just because something isn't a 10 out of a 10 doesn't mean that it's not a health literate material. All right, so I'm going to turn things over for the moment to my colleague, Becca Fried.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So let's do some analysis of a graphic and do a little before and after. So this is an example of something we might start to work with. And there are some good points about this infographic. The photos are pretty simple and easy to recognize. These are common foods and most people could identify them. Maybe that spoon at the bottom, I'm not sure what that is, but it's, I think people can extrapolate that it's some kind of fat or oil. These rows have labels, and they're in an easy to read typeface. I might argue that they could be bigger and more readable than they are. There's a lot here that could be improved. The title here is American, although there might be a facing page that says something else like American foods, but that's an incomplete title and it's a little ambiguous. It leaves room for misunderstanding. Likewise, the photo that was chosen to be behind that page title, American, it's a close-up shot of a picnic basket and a checkered napkin or something. And it's, if you don't look at it just right, you might have a hard time figuring out what that is. If you're not familiar with typical American culture and mythology, that might be a completely meaningless image to you. Also, the white type against that photo is a little bit difficult to read. So all of those things are, those criteria are things that we might suggest making a different choice. The other thing here is that there's no introductory text that explains what you're looking at, and that's pretty important. That's one of the advanced organizer principles that Anthony was just talking about. We want to let people know, very clearly and right up front what readers are going to get if they engage with the communication. We really want to spell it out so there's no ambiguity. The drawings in this first column are not easy to interpret without some work, and they're too subtle to understand easily. Those triangles are apparently food pyramids, but they don't look like the food pyramids that show up in lots of graphics. There's little wedges. You can see the orange and green and red and blue, etc. wedges. And, if I think about it, I imagine that means like the relative proportion that those food groups are supposed to take up in your daily diet. But that takes some work to figure out, and we shouldn't make people work for that. And again, finally, the color coding doesn't seem to be terribly meaningful. And so we don't like to use color coding unless it is it's really clear what it's supposed to signify, and if it adds meaning for the reader. So these are the kinds of judgments we make when we're evaluating the health literacy of materials and trying to improve them. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the another way to present the same information, and so there are some positive differences here. There are a number of health literacy best practices incorporated into the text and the graphic design. The headline explains exactly what the infographic is about, and it's followed by some introductory text. And you'll note that this intro says, here are 2 ways to help you know how much to eat, and there is a facing page, which we'll look at next. There's plenty of white space on this page, which gives the reader's eyes some breaks and makes it for a less overwhelming reading experience. All the photos have labels, which is similar to the infographic of wearing an N95 mask that we looked at a few slides back. The large photo is a visual representation of exactly what readers are being advised to do. They don't have to, kind of take the next mental step to think about, okay, that's a picture of salmon. What am I supposed to do with that? Right here, there is a serving of lean meat right on the plate. The text instructions match up with the illustrations. and the text is chunked. There's bullet points, which lets readers see one instruction per line. Putting series like this into a sentence or paragraph can give people the impression of text that is too dense, and it gives a feeling of too much or too hard, whether or not you've used simple words or sentences. So, I like to think about it. There's the internet acronym TLDR, too much or too long didn't read. Bullet pointing something out helps combat the TLDR effect. So let's look at the facing page with the second way to estimate portion sizes. I'm going to go on to the next one. There we go. So this is similar to the before image we looked at. There's a few notable differences. I'm just, thanks Sharon for pointing out that that's a new food pyramid. That's good information. So what I'm not sure that we're really doing a kind of dialogue. Some of the questions to think about here, I wanted to ask, but I guess maybe we can talk about it at the end. Let's look at the illustrations in the first column. These illustrations are a tool to help readers visualize what a serving size should be. And there are some differences in the way the photos of the foods themselves are different from the example in the before table. All of these photos are they are similarly lit. They are similar in proportions, or they're at the same aspect ratio and size generally. They are accurate representations of what a serving size is. And so there's just an overall sense of coherence and cohesiveness because the photos are all of a similar style and lighting. There is white space. There's clear demarcations between the rows and the columns, which again gives people's eyes a little break, and it makes clear where the information switches from one kind of information to the next. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Yeah, that's great. Let's switch gears now and talk about an important corollary to literacy, which is numeracy. And whereas, literacy we think about as reading and writing, numeracy is facility with numbers. Next slide. So what is numeracy? Numeracy is understanding what numbers mean. So for example, if you learn that your blood pressure is 130/80, can you describe generally what those numbers represent and their significance? Some people can, a lot of people don't. Those are just meaningless numbers. Knowing what to do with those numbers, using the same, blood pressure of 130/80, do you understand if that is high blood pressure or low blood pressure? Do you remember what your target blood pressure is and what you should be doing to achieve it? So both understanding and being able to use numbers. Numeracy is a critical part of health literacy because so many aspects of health information are measurements, and so many aspects of health information involve time. So you need to be able to read and identify things like 2 teaspoons of medicine. You need to recognize abbreviations and understand what they mean, in addition to being able to do basic arithmetic, adding and subtracting and dividing and multiplying. So as communication professionals, it's up to us to support people in understanding and using all the numbers that we tend to sling at them, regardless of how educated we perceive our audience to be. So the next couple of slides will talk about ways that you can do that. So let's move on. Great. So important overall concepts for talking about numbers are give people the main points that you want them to know. Synthesize, give people the gist, and most important points first, and then drill down into details if you need to. An important context, an important point is that descriptive words provide context for numbers. So for example, if you're telling someone your blood pressure is 145/92, you need to tell them what that means. For example, you can say your blood pressure ought to be treated because this puts you at a higher risk of heart attack or stroke. Using both numbers in a verbal description is the best, because if you just say your blood pressure is really high, that is open to interpretation. Somebody might interpret that as less serious than it actually is, or more serious than it actually is. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so tell people what they need to know, no more, no less. So again, there's kind of a theme, which is customize the information to the audience. One tactic for this is to use round numbers and whole numbers whenever possible. We think that countable is something countable and visualizable is a good principle, and like you can't visualize a half a person. So, saying 10.5% is not really, it's a little hard to conceptualize. Don't ask your audience to do math, do the calculations for them. Instead of recommending that someone lose 15% of their body weight, tell them what their target weight loss number is. There are some, you can give them tools for figuring it out, but make them easy to use. Consider what you'd need to do if you had to calculate your own dosage of a medicine. If the dose is 10 milligrams per kilogram and it comes in 60 milligram tablets, it's a multi-step process, and it's a little nerve-wracking, even if you know what your way around formulas, ratios, and a calculator. And I have had this experience where, I've been given big pills and it's like, oh, you figure it out. And then finally, use numbers in a consistent way. And so if you are comparing ratios or percentages, use a common denominator. So don't compare 8 and 10 to 12 and 20. 16 in 20 and 12 and 20 is easier to make a mental comparison of. The same goes for timescales. Don't, talk about one study that was over 5 years and another one that was over 2 years when you're expecting people to make some meaningful inference. Next slide. Okay, risk is a kind of a loaded word, and it has different meanings depending on the audience. Insurers, stock market investors, and health and safety professionals all talk about risk with different meanings. And this sets people up for confusion. One of the things that we try to avoid is using words that can be taken different ways depending on what you understand. We're talking about the health and safety sense of risk, but remember that your audience may bring other meanings to the term, and it influences how they hear you. And as people who are pretty comfortable with science and statistics, we think about risk in a pretty neutral way, but for most people, it has strongly negative connotations. People tend to hear danger when the word risk comes up. However, it's our bread and butter to talk about the likelihood of an event happening based on behavior or external factors like exposure to harmful chemicals. So we want to find ways to communicate these complex concepts in an effective and understandable way. So when we want to motivate particular behavior, we have to approach the communication with empathy. these statistics really matter when they're taught, when they are in reference to your own health. If you've, had a serious diagnosis, you know this viscerally. We've all had, the experience of trying to understand what all of the confusing information about COVID that we've all received. We've all had the experience of trying to interpret what that means for our own life. And so we need to bring empathy for that kind of confusion and anxiety to our discussions of risk. Let's go to the next slide. So 10% of patients had, if the moderators could tell me whether I need to speed up, how much time?
Go ahead, and
should it
we
take?
still have a couple more minutes left. So if you
Alrighty.
want to
Okay,
have
so
about 8
only
minutes
more
left of the
slides.
webinar.
All right, so one statistic 3 ways. 10% of patients had numbness in their hands and feet. 10 out of 100 people had numbness in their hands and feet, or 90 out of 100 people did not have numbness in their hands or feet. You probably all recognize that those are 3 ways to say the same thing. The people who are not as comfortable working with numbers may not recognize that those all mean the same things. When you're talking about risk, it helps to express things, both in the 10 out of 100 people did have this and 90 out of 100 people did not, because you want to communicate both the good side and the bad side of a particular risk. It's one way of lowering people's anxiety and making sure that everyone understands both sides of the coin. For most people, data is easier to understand as a frequency, which is 10 out of 100 or 90 out of 100, and they prefer seeing information that way, as opposed to a percentage. The graphic that's shown here, that's a little bit small, is called an icon array, and these are commonly used infographics for showing a frequency. So, the gray figures are one side of that 10 out of 100, and the purple figures are the other side. So it just lets people see that there are, it's countable and visual. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Okay, so use concrete real world terms whenever you can. Express numbers in ways that are tangible and countable. For example, talk about people versus percent. And this image from the CDC does a good job of conveying the simple message that the Delta variant is more infectious than earlier COVID variants in both words, with the introductory sentence at the top and with the graphic representation. And you can see that the explanatory sentence uses simple words to the extent possible, although I would argue that 2X is not an abbreviation that everyone can understand. And the pictograms show with discrete countable icons more than 2 times as many infections. Okay, let's go on. Okay, absolute risk and relative risk. So we have been talking about, the absolute risk, which is something like 5 out of 100 workers on a fishing boat got frostbite on their hands. And that is the easiest way to understand a ratio for most people. And relative risk is somewhat different. It's a more complex concept, and it's a comparison of 2 similar groups, or 2 similar ratios. It can be 2 groups of people or the same group of people over time. So as an example, 5% of fishers wearing gloves got frostbite, 85% of fishers not wearing gloves got frostbite. And if you synthesize that down to a relative risk, you end up with fishers who wore gloves were 6% as likely to get frostbite as those who did not wear gloves. That is a really abstract way of expressing that comparison, and it's out of reach for most people. So it's really better to use the expanded sentences that take people through the comparison of the two absolute risks. So there's let's go ahead and conclude with questions.
Thank you both so much for that great presentation. If anybody has any more questions, you can enter them into the Q&A box in lieu of the chat. So if you can go to the Q&A box in the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will be asking the questions to our presenters in just a second.
So looking at this first question here about stories and narratives, for sure they have plenty of uses. People remember stories. They identify with stories. Stories pull people in. So that's an important component, depending on the kind of information you're trying to convey. Characters, if it's something that was longer form, yeah, maybe you'd want to do that, but it really depends on the situation. I would say, though, that what is, I haven't, my screen's not on, sorry. I would say, though, that what is super important is the idea of a narrative arc, right? So even if you're not using characters and writing a story in a genuine sense, you still want to think about it in terms of beginning, a middle, and an end. And it might be, so for instance, maybe you develop a patient brochure that's, before your visit, during your visit, and after your visit. Well, that's a narrative arc, right? And that's something that's easy for people to remember. This is what I do at this point. This is what I do at the next point, et cetera. So narrative for sure has a significant part to play in lots of communications, whatever they are.
Thank you. The second part of the question also asks, when talking about risk, do folks address our widely or wildly differing risk perceptions? Do you see that coming up a lot as part of the conversation?
That's not something that comes up in our work a lot, but we do know that there are different ways of expressing a statistic do influence people's perception of the risk. So the more concrete that you can make your description, the more likely people are to have a realistic assessment of what that risk is.
And kind of compounding on that, another participant asked, how about communicating types of uncertain risk?
Yeah, that's tough. And COVID is a great example of that. I think the best thing to do is to acknowledge the uncertainty, to lay out what the state of knowledge in the clearest, simplest terms possible, focus on what is known, and acknowledge that that there are unknowns as well.
Thank you. And Anthony, feel free to chime in if you have any further feedback.
Sure. Well, I do about the next one about.
Yes. So the next question, yeah, how do we incorporate people with disabilities into your usability testing and communications development?
It's quite simple. Just talk to them, right? Bring them into your development process, whether initially or through usability testing. One thing that I didn't say before that we do when we do usability testing is we screen all our participants. So we try to find people from various socioeconomic backgrounds, but the one factor that everyone has to have in common is that they have to have limited health literacy. And there are a few questions that help us gauge whether or not someone struggles with health information. It's a validated series of questions that help us just over the phone in a brief interview, allows us to understand. So there are times too when we do usability testing, and because you're giving out $50, $75 for an interview, sometimes you get people who are just there for the money, right? So if maybe you go through the motions, you give them the money, but then you find someone else, and that's all. So it's never a perfect process. Sometimes we're looking for people and we think we have them, but we don't, so we have to go find more people. So, but yeah, for sure. So this, it would be the same thing with people with disabilities. We've done a lot of work in this area in the past. We haven't done anything, I would say, in the past 5 years, but in the past, we've done a lot of work in that area.
Thanks again. Let's move on to the next question. And I know that we are close to time, but we're going to go ahead and keep going through and answer a couple more questions. So please feel free to our participants to stay on board with us as we get through some of these.
Recommended reading on improving health literacy is the next one.
Yes. So do we have any recommended reading on improving health literacy?
I think we can. What were you going to say, Anthony?
I was going to say one of the best places to go is the CDC's health literacy website.
That's true.
And to get familiar too with the Clear Communication Index, that'll give you some ways to look at a material you're developing. But there are lots of resources out in the world, and really it's just a matter of practice. It's like all writing. So one of the best bits, one of the best things I've ever heard about writing or designing was from one of my old instructors who says, I can't teach you how to write, but like an old golf pro, I can shave a few points off your game. And I feel like that's exactly what you get from these materials, is just that sense of I can make little incremental improvements if you're not already, employing a lot of these best practices.
But
yeah,
an overall, an overall awareness. I think the training materials that are out there give you an orientation so you can start to understand what the issues are. And the more you work with it, the more you see where things can be improved.
Yes, and I just wanted to add that we can add some of these resources, if any come up on your mind, by tomorrow morning into the email that you guys will be getting tomorrow from COEH.
We can certainly supply some.
Thank you. Let's see, so for our next question, what format are you finding most effective? Social media, infographics, et cetera, and with which types of audiences? I think that just goes with regard to health communication.
Sure. So it really depends on the audience that you're trying to reach. So if you're trying to reach a teen, you're not going to use, even if you're not going to send a booklet, you're not going to even use Facebook, right? You're going to maybe use TikTok or Instagram or another avenue. So it really depends.
And it depends on the message.
Yes, for sure. So, yeah.
And how do you communicate information when an audience has preconceived or incorrect information already? With a great example is, COVID vaccination or masking, when there's so many, other things out there.
I would say no one has the answer to that question.
Yeah.
It's certainly not in this particular topic. It's obviously very difficult to convince people just through a communication to take an action like this when when politics come into play, when belief systems are really strong. It's very difficult to break those down, and usually the intervention probably has to come from a peer.
The things that are seeming to work are a trusted messenger, someone from your own community, and repetition, and possibly the same consistent message from a variety of sources. If you're hearing the same message over time, and if you're hearing it from someone who's influential and and trust, you're more likely to take that on and take the action that is recommended. But it takes time, so it's not a one-shot deal.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And I'll go ahead and get to our very last question. And that's, what are you learning about how to create good quality translations? And are you, for example, finding that you need different Spanish versions depending on maybe their country of origin? I think that kind of goes to understanding that structural competency idea.
I can speak to this, so Becca, but so it's not easy, and especially when you move outside of even Spanish, as a common second language here in California. You would think it should be easy, but it's not. It's not at all easy to translate and feel assured that your translation is reaching everyone you want it to. So I can tell you a little bit about our process. We have a designated translator who we think is pretty good. We then test that translation with our audience, right? And when we translate, we're kind of translating for, the broadest audience we can in California, in terms of the Spanish and not too many regionalisms, that kind of thing. And the differences between countries can be really significant in some cases. So we're really just trying to capture the most people, unless we have a really specific audience, right? So general Spanish, we're usually trying to reach, primarily Mexican Spanish-speaking audience. But again, it all depends, right? So essentially, we would then test that translation with our audience. As part of the process, we'd also have that translation independently reviewed by another translator or reviewer. There are lots of things you can do to kind of figure out whether you're on the right track, and whether people are being tripped up over various parts of your translation. So it depends on how long the translation, all those kinds of things. But so there are ways that you can kind of ensure that you're communicating clearly, but unless you yourself are really fluent, it's really difficult to know for certain, right? And you have to test with your audience. And the other thing is to start with health literate materials, right? So if you have a material that's already easy to understand and read, the translation will likewise be, at least partly easier to understand and read. So again, those are some of the ways that you might ensure that you're reaching the audience you intend.
Great, thank you. And Becca, did you have anything to add before we wrap up? Oh, you're muted.
Just that, doing good translations is a whole specialty in and of itself. It takes resources and finding good people to advise you, and it takes a lot of work. So it looks like we had one final question, and it's a good question.
Yeah, I saw that too. I was going to say, I also work in communication, so this is actually a really good question that I agree with. So do you worry at all that you're making communication too simple for some audiences? And in a mixed audience, do you want everyone to understand, but you don't want to dismiss people as, I guess I'm assuming that they wouldn't understand. So how do you go about that?
Well, it's a really common, sort of objection, and I wouldn't say exactly misconception, but it's the thing that people think often is that if we dumb this down too much, it's going to be insulting to some members of our audience. But research has found that, like, if you make something extremely easy to read, then people who have, are really skilled readers, or skilled at parsing whatever your communication is, it just makes it faster and more efficient for them. And going back to Anthony's example about, did you actually use the IKEA instructions example?
I did, yeah.
Mention that. Yeah. So it's I was a little bit too tense to be listening super closely, but yeah, it's like if you make things very easy, you make it easier across the board. And rarely do people perceive that, oh my God, this is babyish for me. So.
And just to add to that briefly, I think you have to assess your audience, right? So if your audience is truly mixed, you want to capture as many people as you can to go start from that place. And if you feel there's a part of your audience that maybe you're not reaching with your communication because it's too simple, or I shouldn't say too simple, but there's not enough information, right? Because really one of the things that we didn't talk about is one of the skills of health literacy is learning what is the right amount of information, and what's necessary, what's essential information, right? What's out of scope. And if there's information that you've determined is out of scope that you think someone else wants, you can very easily direct them to that. Or have a second, material that's on that topic only, right? So people could access it if they wanted to, but it really depends on the situation and who you're trying to reach and who your audience is and all those other factors.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. Oh, go ahead, Becca.
Sorry. Are you trying to wind up? Because we can talk a lot about
shortly,
this.
But please, by all means, I just wanted to add that someone did say, thank you for noting that, common language and everyday language is not, dumb or dumbing things down. It's just everyday language. So
Yeah.
if we do have any resources on that, they would appreciate that as well.
Certainly. Yeah, we've given you a couple of principles that may seem like they are in conflict with each other, which is that you want to know your audience and be empathetic with your audience, but also we've said, use the universal precautions principle that everyone benefits from highly accessible materials, and they're not actually in conflict. The first one is, know your audience, really has to do with focusing your message on what you really want people to know. So they're sort of related or interrelated.
Yes, thank you. And I want to thank everybody who joined us today for the webinar, and especially to our speakers for being here with us today. As a reminder, an email will go out tomorrow with some of these resources, links, and a copy of this webinar. So the recording will be and include with the evaluation link, so you can get your certificate of completion. If you have any questions, email us at coehce@berkeley.edu. Be sure to check out our website for more information and register for upcoming events, and that's coeh.berkeley.edu/about-CE. So thank you again for all of your wonderful questions and participation in today's webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.